All right, today we're going to talk about U.S. policy in Latin America after the Cuban Revolution, which contains a whole lot of U.S. involvement in other Latin American countries and a whole lot of U.S. support for coups and dictatorships and whatnot, largely as the U.S. government looks to avoid the possibility of another Castro or another Cuba emerging in Latin America that would overthrow or remove U.S.-backed government and possibly lead to the rise of communism in other Latin American countries. So after the Cuban Revolution, the U.S. anti-communist crusade in Latin America really goes into hyperdrive. So we have 5 countries here to talk about, and the first one we'll go through is Honduras. U.S. banana companies and banks had largely used the Honduran military to control the Honduran economy and the government in order to control the economy ever since the early 1900s. So we've talked about that already before. Honduras had some civilian presidents since 1945, but the U.S.-backed military, Honduran military, mostly controlled the government even while those civilian presidents were in office in different times, fits and starts after 45. The U.S. was largely interested in controlling Honduras because, as you see on the map, it's right in the middle of Central America and it borders 3 other Central American countries, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala, that the United States is further interested in controlling. So the U.S. Thinks Honduras is important to use as a type of staging area for interventions or invasions that the U.S. could kind of mass troops and supplies in Honduras and use those troops to go into one of those other 3 countries just across the border. Some younger military officers allowed a reform-minded politician named Ramon Videla Morales to run and win the presidential election in Honduras in 1957. So he goes into office. He talks about some fairly liberal ideas, talks about the U.S.-led Alliance for Progress, which is an attempt by the U.S. to basically give a bunch of money to Latin American countries to convince them to not lean toward communism. Moderate, liberal type ideas still got him into conflict with the older military officers who wanted to return Honduras to direct military control that they had enjoyed before 1945. So they basically knock him out of office in 1963. He's 6 years into a presidency, and they replace him with one of their own, Osvaldo Lopez Arellano. And he'll stay in office for 12 years, largely doing what the other military officers wanted. So it becomes a type of dictatorship. And he is only knocked out in another military coup that sets up another government in 75 that will last until 1981. And the United States government fully supports each of these military dictators from 63 forward. The United States will reportedly send over $200 million in financial support to these dictators running Honduras between 1963 and 1980. And the Honduran government dictatorship lasts even a little bit beyond that. The military dictators, they were being criticized for quite a long time. So by 1981, they are open to allowing some type of semi-democratic elections by 1981. And the Liberal Party won 54% of that vote, and therefore would go into office in 1981 and start demanding increasing amounts of democratic reforms. So that's when the dictatorship finally starts to get rolled back in the 1980s. But just as we've talked about today, Hondurans live under some type of military dictatorship or other for the most part, at least. So that's going on 40 years. So that's an adult's lifetime. So that's quite a significant thing. Next country on our list is Guyana. We haven't talked a whole lot about Guyana so far in the course. Guyana is one of the few remaining European colonies in Latin America by the end of World War II, 1945. It had been a British colony for quite a long time. There were 3 different European colonies called the, quote, Guianas. There's a French one, I think a Dutch one, and a British one. But British Guiana started moving toward independence after World War II. The British largely let a lot of their colonies go independent after World War II because they couldn't afford to maintain them and support them and keep control over them. So a lot of British colonies around the world are going independent in the late 40s and 1950s. And Guyana is just one of those, British Guiana. And based on that opportunity, national elections are announced in British Guiana set for 1950. And one of the more popular politicians is named Cheddi Jagan. So he starts a political party and announces a fairly nationalist and socialist type of platform. He wants worker compensation laws. Guyana is one of the poorest countries in the world. It is largely agricultural based, so anyone who kind of gets hurt in those types of workplaces, without any worker compensation, they could be unemployed to the point of starving to death. So it's much like the kind of European economy in the 1800s, where you basically work until you physically cannot work anymore, and once you can't work, you make no wages. There's no retirement system, there's no pension system, and if you don't have someone to kind of take care of you, likely die at that point. So it's a pretty horrible circumstance for most Guianan workers. So Jagan proposed a major worker compensation system. He proposed a universal education system, at least for children. So he wanted to build up what we would probably see as a normal childhood education system up through 16, 18 years old, so that the population could become literate. Illiteracy was another major problem in Guyana at the time. And so was housing. So Jagan proposes government funded housing projects, if not outright government owned housing, that they would then rent to poor Guianan people at very low cost. So he is proposing a lot of things that nationalist and kind of post-colonial politicians run on during elections all around the world as these former European colonies start going independent. And these nationalist leaders just want to build up the kind of health and welfare of their own poor countries. So Jagan is pretty well in line with a lot of that, but like we've talked about before, those kind of policies also greatly anger and scare some countries, especially the United States. So the CIA in 1950 concludes that Jagan himself might not be a total dedicated communist, but that his policy programs, the stuff that he's running on in his campaign, are kind of, quote, hints toward wanting to establish some kind of communism in the far-term future if he ever wins office and leads the Guianan government. So the CIA says that he's not a full-bore Stalinist. He doesn't want military repression or anything like that, but his economic policies might lead to communism eventually, which could lead to a Guianan dictatorship. So Jagan runs in these elections. The elections are really delayed in 1950 until 1953. So Jagan and his party come back in 1953. They win in those elections. They run in those elections, and they win. Those elections were allowed to go forward. So the vote occurs, and Jagan and his party outright won the elections, and he would form the new government. But the British and the U.S. Are very afraid of his policies again for leading toward kind of communistic leanings or something like that. So the United States government convinced the British to actually recolonize Guyana, make it back into a British colony for a few years, and then hold other rounds of national elections in a few years, and they would hope that Jagan wouldn't win those elections in the future. So the British actually do that. They annul the 1953 results and recolonize Guyana and set new national elections for 1957. And guess what? Jagan and his party come back in 1957. They win those elections also. So no big surprise there. Same policy proposals. So Jagan is the most famous and most popular politician in the country. And at this point, the British say, okay, no more of this. They allow Guyana to become an independent country. So they're on the path of independence. And Jagan will be allowed to form the new government in 57. And he does. And he starts putting these policies into effect. The British see him as basically a socialist who wants to use government revenue to build social systems for the poor and whatnot. So by 57, the British had become kind of convinced that Jagan was not a communist. He did not want to form any alliances with the Soviet Union or anything like that to win the Cold War. But the United States is still very worried as Jagan starts running the Guianan government that Jagan is going to try to make Guyana into another Cuba, especially after Castro's revolt wins in Cuba in 1959. So that seems to be the turning point, 1959-1960, that U.S. leaders are now worried after the Cuban Revolution that any movement of socialist or leftist anywhere in Latin America could create a, quote, second Cuba somewhere in Latin America. So the U.S. government's going to basically start targeting different Latin American groups in any country that they feel is a threat. And Jagan at this point starts making foreign deals, especially with Cuba itself. So Jagan was warned about this kind of stuff. He didn't listen to the warnings. He thought it was ridiculous that that the U.S. would target some tiny poor country like Guyana as like a threat to the U.S. attempt to control the world or something like that. So Jagan thinks it's totally unreasonable that the U.S. would target Guyana or him for any reason. And Jagan's argument is pretty simple. Guyana is a very poor country. It's agriculture based. Britain had been running it as a colony under the cash crop system that we've talked about before. And Guyana's big export product is rice. So that's basically the giant thing that their economy produces and sells on the international market. So Jagan starts negotiating with foreign countries to sell Guianan rice for the best price he can get. And Cuba, Castro, offers the best price. So Jagan signs a trade deal with Castro to sell Guianan rice to Cuba at the best price that they can get. And it's a good deal for Cuba because most of Cuba's economy was based in sugar. So Cuba needs to import food to feed its population because its farms are dedicated to this luxury product, sugar. So the United States looked at this as this is Jagan signing a deal with the big communist leader in Latin America, and that seemed to be evidence to the U.S. that Jagan wanted to push Guyana further and further left to develop a communist economy and a dictatorship and on and on and on. Jagan's argument is just, we're selling our best product at the highest price we could get, and we need that money to start industrializing Guyana and helping the poor. But the U.S. leaders weren't really interested in that argument so much. So in 1960 and going into early 61, U.S. leaders convinced themselves under the incoming Kennedy administration that Jagan's leadership of Guyana was simply using democratic elections as a means of gaining power for their first step, and their eventual goal was to transform the Guianan economy into full-scale communism and then sign a military alliance with the Soviet bloc and bring communism to as much of Latin America as they could to try to win the Cold War for the Soviet side. And in retrospect, those are like several logical leaps, and to even accuse someone of trying to use democratic elections as a means of gaining power, well, I mean, yeah, that's what democracy is. You form a political party, you run for office, and you try to get votes. So a lot of these accusations and ideas that Guyana is going to like tip the balance in the Cold War for the Soviets to win, in retrospect, seems fairly ridiculous. But that's what the U.S. government believed at the time, say early 1961. So Jagan actually goes to Washington, D.C. and meets with Kennedy in person, as we see here. And Kennedy, to Jagan's face, says, yes, we're going to help you. U.S. government's going to send money to Guyana to start industrialization, to stabilize the country, to alleviate poverty, all these really nice things. But at the exact same moment, the Kennedy administration orders the CIA to start doing things to destabilize Jagan's government. So the big thing that the CIA thinks will be useful in Guyana is to start a bunch of race riots, especially in the big city, the capital city, because there's several different ethnicities that make up the Guyanan population. One is Spanish and British from the old colonial days. Another is the native population, the indigenous groups. And a third are a lot of Africans who had been brought over to Guyana and enslaved during the colonial era. So there are Africans, Native Americans, and kind of European inheritors all mixed together in Guyana by the 1960s. And the CIA feels that starting race riots that could turn violent and kill lots of people could be enough to destabilize Jagan's government and force him to resign. And the CIA starts doing that stuff. So by early 1962, you start getting race riots that the CIA supports and even pays some of the early rioters to go out and start the damage in order to kick this thing off. That didn't work. The Jagan's government gained control over those riots fairly quickly and reestablished public order. So then the Kennedy administration secretly backed a general strike in Guyana in summer of '63 to try to completely destroy the Guyanan economy and force Jagan to resign. That didn't work. So the strike starts off, but it's not very successful. And in November '63, Kennedy himself is assassinated. So his vice president Johnson takes over and completely believes all this stuff that the CIA is telling him about Jagan being a communist. So the Johnson administration promotes more race riots in 1964 that do become large enough and destabilizing enough to force Jagan to resign. So Jagan did resign from his office, the prime minister position in Guyana, and that opened the door to another politician to form a new political party and run in the 1964 elections to try to create a new government. And that guy's name is Forbes Burnham. And Burnham formed a new political party and ran in the elections in '64. Directly as an opponent to Jagan's party, even though Jagan has resigned, his allies continue to run his party. Burnham took support from the CIA to win that election, and actually did win that election based on inflaming racial hatreds and making kind of promises to different segments of the population. So he won the election. And right after the election, went into office and started building a dictatorship. And this will be a hardcore military dictatorship, largely based on racism, especially anti-native racism, defining indigenous Guyanans, Native Americans, as backward and less evolved and open for total repression. So there's a lot of kind of racial superiority among Burnham and his party and their ideology. So they become a brutal racist dictatorship that stays in office largely through a combination of repressing anyone who complains and also taking full support from the U.S. government, because at the same time they're doing all this, they also wipe out communists. And they promise the U.S. government that they will continue to do so. So the U.S. government gives full, outright, clear support to this horrific dictatorship in Guyana that will last until the early 1990s, when Burnham finally dies, and shows us a lot of kind of how the U.S. responds in the post-Cuban revolutionary era, say starting in 1959, 1960, with support for anybody who will keep out communists from any country, no matter what kind of political system they use to do so. So next country on our list is Brazil. Last time we talked about Brazil was largely under President Vargas. So he had won the presidency and then built up a dictatorship with a new constitution and everything. And he lasted in office under that dictatorship until 1945, when a military coup kicked him out and starts a kind of new era of government for Brazil. Vargas had called for national elections to create a representative group of the nation to write a new Brazilian constitution. And those elections went forward. That group met in late 1945 and going into 46 and did write a new constitution, but largely just kind of brings back a lot of the big pieces of the former constitution that Vargas had put through in 1934. And under this new constitution that's passed in 1946, national elections are called. And one of Vargas's helpers previously, in the 1930s, was elected president of the whole country in 1945-6, and so he will go into office. His name is, he was a general. His name was Eurico Dutra. So he won the 1945-6 presidential election and will go into office. But Dutra angers Vargas and a whole lot of Vargas's supporters who had voted for him, for Dutra, by basically ending a lot of Vargas's systems for industrialization, urbanization, especially a lot of the kind of government assistance to industrializing companies to build factories and whatnot. And Dutra seems to be pushing the economy back toward a kind of colonial state where they mostly just grow coffee and export it as a cash crop on the international markets. So Vargas was very angry with Dutra, basically saying that he kind of ran on these promises to continue all those systems, and then once he got into office, turned his back on all of it and tried to push Brazil back into a colonial era type economy, a cash crop economy. So Dutra is so unpopular by the 1950 elections that he can't even really run for re-election very much. So his party kind of chose someone else to run as their nominee, and Vargas actually comes back in 1950 and runs for president with his old party. So it's largely a decision for voters between Vargas and Dutra's inheritor. And of course Vargas said that, you know, Dutra and the inheritor turned their back on the Brazilian people and you know, are trying to turn the clock back to a more colonial era with a lot of repression. So Vargas won that election in 1950 and would be inaugurated for another presidential term in 1951. Right when they went into office, Vargas and his advisors created a very large study of the entire Brazilian economy with a lot of help from the United States economists that came to Brazil. And their general finding was that if Brazil suddenly modernized, invested quite a lot of money to build up its energy and transportation networks, that doing so would unleash this massive amount of economic growth. So the theory is that Brazil should borrow a bunch of money to build those systems, the energy and transportation systems especially, these massive kind of road and highway and railroad projects and oil drilling projects. And that if they did that, Brazil's economy would skyrocket, and the government would make so much tax revenue off of that booming economy that they could easily pay off the loan. So the U.S. offered big loans, U.S. government loans to Brazil, which Vargas and many other Brazilians thought was a better deal than going to foreign banks, because they had learned to hate foreign banks so much. So they do take on, under Vargas's leadership, they do take on a lot of loans directly from the U.S. government. And then Vargas went and did a fairly interesting thing. He created a kind of public-private hybrid company called Petrobras to control all oil exploration and production in Brazil. So petro is basically means oil, refining into gasoline, petroleum, and Bras is just short for Brazil. So Petrobras is has a lot of government input by nominating and approving Petrobas's governors, the board of governors, who kind of high administrators, but it is also an investor-based company. So it's like this kind of combination of government-owned and private-owned company. And it'll be extraordinarily successful throughout Brazil's history in not just mining the oil and selling it, but giving a very strong return for any investors, and also a very strong amount of revenue for the government on a yearly basis. So this seems to be a very popular and successful program, and still exists today. The Brazilian economy does start to grow fairly quickly right after all this in 52, 53, but they also start experiencing a lot of inflation. So inflation starts to go up to about 11% in 1952, and it goes all the way up to 20% in 1953. Food prices start to go up with inflation also. So if you don't have wage increases, then the average workforce, suddenly they can't afford to pay rent or buy food or anything like that, and that tends to anger them. So there are several different ways that Vargas's advisors kind of told him that you can deal with the inflation and try to kind of slow things down and get Brazil back on a kind of more stable economic growth path. Some advisors, more conservative people, told him that he needs to start cutting the government budget, and that government borrowing is driving the inflation. So that's what we generally call austerity. The government has to balance its spending with its income, so it stops borrowing to pay its yearly bills. And if it stops borrowing, that will slow down inflation. So Vargas listened to that, and he did it. He implemented major government budget cuts, which cut government workers and salaries and a bunch of things. At the same time, quickly after that, he goes with more liberal interpretations of how to deal with inflation, which is to kick up worker wages. So if workers have enough money to actually buy things at the inflated prices, then that will avert the disaster. So Vargas basically does both at the same time. He both cuts austerity, he cuts budgets, government budgets, but he also raises worker wages, minimum wage. But the inflation continues, and conservatives say that he should have just gone with the conservative budget cutting idea and not done the minimum wage thing. And of course liberals say that he should have just done the minimum wage increase and not cut the budget. So they basically blame him for whichever side that they disagreed with in his policy. So Vargas is in a pretty tough political place. A lot of Brazilians are getting angry at the inflation because, again, they're falling behind in being able to afford these goods. And in 1954, there are major corruption stories involving not Vargas himself personally so much, but some of his lower-level advisors and people in the government. And when some investigating journalists into these corruption accusations end up being murdered, that creates a lot of paranoia about the government, that the government is going off and killing off people who ask questions and investigate. So eventually these kind of combined corruption and murder conspiracy ideas start reaching all the way up to Vargas himself, and he commits suicide. He shoots himself in August 1954. So that's the end of him. Over 20 some odd years, from 1930 into the 1950s, he was probably the most powerful and important Brazilian politician and national leader, and he's gone in August of 54. So his supporters see him as like this great leader who chose to kill himself rather than give in, so they see him as like a martyr to Brazil's economic development and attempt to escape control from foreign countries. So suddenly when the president kills himself, a vice president goes into office, and normal elections are called for 1955. And a pretty general, kind of fairly bland candidate is elected in 55 and inaugurated in 56. The economic problems continue, especially the inflation. And this president was elected under basically an alliance of several different political parties, so he's getting advice from all sides about what to do. Some tell him to try to get loans from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is this big international lender. But the IMF demanded even more budget cuts in order to get those loans in the first place. So it was a deal, and this president basically refused because he said that the budget cuts would destroy all his economic goals for Brazil. So he basically just refused to take those loans and just really hoped that the economy would find a way out of these problems. But by 1960, the next round of elections, he's so unpopular that he's going to be out of office, and pretty much everybody knows it. The winner of the 1960 election, it's an interesting little story. He wins the 1960 election and then resigns the presidency after only 6 or 7 months. And historians don't even understand why, even by this point, 60 some odd years later. One of the better guesses is that this president offered to resign thinking that Congress would refuse, and offered to kind of increase his powers as president in order to convince him to not resign, which is an odd thing because the powers are all laid out in the Constitution. But either way, the winner of the 1960 election resigned in 7 months and made his vice president the new president. And the vice president was a populist, leftist type of politician. He's been a populist and very famous in Brazil for, well, around a decade or so. So his whole political career was built on populism and opposition to military control over the country and opposition to dictatorship all over Latin America. So he's been very kind of outspoken about that for years. So people generally know what they're getting with this guy, and his name is João Goulart. And of course the military hated him for these kinds of things because the new president, Goulart, wants to limit the military powers, he wants to cut their budget, and he actually wants to shrink the military. He wants to basically pay fewer and fewer soldiers. So the military really hate him because he's shrinking their budgets and they think that he's a giant threat. Goulart did accept the austerity type program that his advisors told him he should do. So he goes with austerity, so he starts cutting government budgets in order to get inflation largely under control. So you see a bunch of government budget cuts in order to balance the budget. You see government employees' wages being cut. You see the amount of loans that the government is willing to give to private businesses being cut. So the United States and the IMF supported all of these ideas in order to give the loans in the first place, which is the same old stuff that U.S. and IMF had been advocating for Brazil, going back to at least 1953. And Goulart's implementing it. But his implementation of budget cuts really hits the military the most because he's very critical of the military from the outset. So the military leaders really start to hate him when he starts cutting the military budget more and more and more and more over his term in office. In 1964, early 64, Goulart starts talking about calling up rural worker and urban worker alliance, so basically farmers and middle-class city workers, into a political alliance to run for re-election. And that's the kind of final straw that scares the Brazilian conservatives and the Brazilian military and of course the U.S. government, because they're all afraid that Goulart is going to use this massive alliance of workers to win the next election and then start some kind of communist dictatorship. So they thought that Goulart was trying to create another Cuba in Brazil, and the U.S. and Brazilian conservatives were obsessed with stopping that. So they launched the coup in March 1964 and stop it. They kick him out of office, and the military sets up an authoritarian government that's mostly led by generals. Every once in a while they try to keep some amount of democracy. They bring some of the older politicians who had advised democratically elected presidents. They bring them in as advisors and technocrats and put them into cabinet positions and whatnot. And the military will allow some democratic elections to choose congressional lawmakers. But everyone in Brazil knows that the military is really running the place. And many times, even when they allow a democracy to have elections in Brazil, especially for Congress. If the elections turn out the way that the military doesn't like, they basically start changing the rules for the elections at the last minute in order to ensure that that those candidates lose. And the Brazilian government starts quickly, the military government starts issuing a series of what they call institutional acts, which are laws that are outside the Constitution but gives the central government more and more power. So several of these acts give the executive branch of the federal government the power to amend the Constitution all by itself, which is, completely illegitimate. It allows the executive branch to create its own spending laws and ask Congress for approval. And of course, because the military has its own friends in Congress, Congress basically approve anything that the executive military branch wants. And also the power for the executive branch to end or rescind the political rights of any Brazilian person for up to 10 years. So what we would think of as human rights, your right to freedom of speech and owning property and saying what you want in public, the executive branch is allowed to take that away from individual Brazilians for up to 10 years under these institutional acts that start to get promulgated in '64 and in the years that follow. And the United States quickly endorsed and recognized the new government, the military dictatorship in Brazil, which is pretty obvious why. It's because the U.S. government had planned the coup that put that government in office in the first place. And the U.S. government had stopped giving loans to Goulart in late '63, early '64 in order to pressure him to resign. And once the military takes over Brazil in March '64, the U.S. starts releasing those loans very quickly again. So literally the U.S. government starts funding the Brazilian dictatorship almost right off the bat once it gets off the ground. And Brazil will get some of the highest levels of U.S. financial assistance of any country in the world for the next couple decades. The Brazilian government allowed some degree of free congressional elections in October '74, and when the anti-military political party, the opposition party, won those elections in a giant landslide, which proves how much the Brazilian voters hated this dictatorship, the military dictatorship just basically annulled the election and then changed the rules for the elections to proceed again until they got the results that they wanted. So again, the dictatorship is, they'll say that you're allowed to have democracy, but when you actually start to vote in the way that you want and against the way that they want, then they'll change the rules in order to disenfranchise the Brazilian voters. And the military, they're not very good at running the government. They keep stability because they're repressing so many people, and they stay in office through this massive fraud, but they're not very good at running the economy. So foreign debts start to rise because they're borrowing so much money from abroad, inflation starts to rise, and industrial production starts to go down. So the story of the 1970s is that Brazil is in an economically bad place, and workers in Brazil start a series of major strikes in 1978 through 1980. So it's not one giant strike that lasts all those years, but it's a series of smaller strikes targeted among specific types of workers and sectors of the economy. So one of the more famous leaders, union leader of these strikes, is named Luiz Inácio da Silva. He's often called Lula as a nickname. So Lula da Silva is one of the major national leaders calling for people to go on strike from 1978 to 1980, and it's extremely successful. And by this point, the military repression is just obvious, and the whole world knows about it. So U.S. President Carter even traveled himself to Brazil to tell the military dictators that in person that he would not support the Brazilian government anymore if they continued the amount of repression and torture and executions and such things, that eventually they're going to have to answer for what they've done. And the U.S. president is saying you're not going to get a whole lot of funding from the U.S. government anymore if you continue these policies. So that tends to lead to another military group of officers taking over in 1979. And they did that. They kind of knocked out their opponents in 79 specifically to stop a lot of this dictatorship because they couldn't lose that U.S. support. That was what was really keeping them going. So this new military government that enters in 1979 quickly signs some new laws to offer general amnesty to political prisoners that frees most political prisoners outright from jail immediately. Allows exiled Brazilians who had been kicked out of the country for speaking out against a dictatorship, allows them to return, and sets up 3 new political parties to run in democratic elections going into the early 1980s. So that's the major transition point. And it's largely due to international pressure from the United States to make some kind of democratic reforms, and also internal pressure from their own Brazilian workers going on strike and demanding change. And that moves us to the next country on our list, which is Bolivia. Bolivia had a very contested presidential election in 1951, was still under dictatorship at that point, and a very popular political candidate won the vote in 1951, but the military dictatorship basically annulled the election and tried to put their own chosen candidate back into power. So a major uprising of people, of Bolivians, led by especially the miners' union, the MNR, started an uprising in the next few months going into 1952 that eventually overthrew the military dictatorship and demanded that the candidate who had gotten the most votes, who had won the election the previous year, actually become the new president. So that becomes known as the Revolution of 1952, and that candidate is named Victor Paz Estenssoro. He was very popular because he made giant campaign promises, mostly to mine workers and other poor people throughout the country. So he got finally a majority of the vote. So his major campaign promises were to nationalize the mines, which would give the government control over the refining mills for copper and tin and other things that the Bolivian mines produced. And if the government controlled the refining process, it would have a lot of influence over controlling the prices at which the refined finalized tin or copper or whatever could be sold on the international market. So that was the nationalization of the mines was seen as a strategy in order to raise the price of sale for the final product and bring more revenue into Bolivia and the government and its companies. Estenssoro also promised wage increases for virtually all workers, but especially for the miners. And that helped bring the miners' union more toward the kind of middle of the country politically, and gave them a much larger support base amongst the general population. So the miners' union becomes more of a general federation of industrial workers and even some agricultural workers in Bolivia. So it becomes a kind of general labor federation. And they continue to push for better wages for their members and better working conditions for virtually all Bolivians. Estenssoro also promised, and when he became president, pushed for increasing government subsidies for basic economic needs like food or housing or something like this. And one of his big government initiatives was to increase voter registration, largely by dropping all the literacy tests that prohibited a lot of the uneducated, poor workers throughout the country from voting at all in previous elections. And he also expanded voting rights for Native Americans living in Bolivia. So those groups, largely the poor workforce and the natives, have been excluded from the political process through various means like literacy tests and other restrictive things. Estenssoro pushed to end all those restrictions, and the amount of voters in Bolivia grew pretty exponentially in the few years after that, eventually topping out at around 5 times the original number of voters in 1951. So of course Estenssoro and his party figured that if they register people to vote, those people that are now allowed to register would be so thankful to the party for pushing through this reform in the first place, that they would continue voting for the party's nominees far into the future. Estenssoro did not trust the military much at all because it had conspired to keep him out of office in 1951 and had tried to fight back against the revolution in 1952. So he was very supportive of cutting down the military, reducing its size and its budget allocation, which means cutting the amount of money that the government spent on military projects and military personnel during his time in office. So as a commander-in-chief, they pushed through budget cuts to the military to reduce the military's influence over the government. And of course the military didn't like that at all. And other conservative elements throughout Bolivia don't like Estenssoro or his party much at all because they're going to see their taxes go up to pay for the government subsidies and the nationalizations. They're going to lose property. If they own companies, they're going to have to pay the increased minimum wage, basically. So a lot of conservative and landed and wealthy interests throughout Bolivia are very angry about all this, particularly against Estenssoro personally and his political party in general. But Estenssoro and his policies were so overwhelmingly popular amongst the vast majority of Bolivians that Estenssoro himself did not go for re-election in 1956. He allowed his vice president to instead kind of go for it. So the vice president runs for the presidency in that election in 56 and got 83% of the vote, which is a gigantic majority, almost unheard of in most modern democracies. So the population was solidly on the side of all this stuff. And this vice president, who now becomes president in 56, named Zuazo, right when he gets into office, the country starts seeing its inflation rate rise. So inflation is kind of defined as the big problem facing Bolivia in the late 50s. And Zuazo tried to solve that by gaining loans from the United States banks and also the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and all those institutions demanded that Zuazo start going backward on a lot of things that Estenssoro had accomplished earlier in the previous term, largely because the Bolivian government was starting to run deficits, and banks usually hate deficits because it's kind of hurts the bottom line of whatever entity you're talking about, hurts the profit margin if you're borrowing year after year to pay your bills. So the bankers internationally really demand that Bolivia start cutting its government budgets on a yearly basis, which is known as austerity in economic terms. And Zuazo felt that he had to do that to get the kind of bailout loans from the international bankers, and so he went along with it, which angered a huge amount of the voters who had just elected him in 56. Zuazo also pushed the Bolivian government much closer to the U.S. Through certain trade deals and economic deals and discussions about an outright military alliance. Zuazo likes having partnership with the U.S., especially through the kind of Cold War lens. So Zuazo is going to promise to ensure that communists never get into power in Bolivia in order to get a lot of favoritism from the U.S. And the United States government had tried to use that amount of influence over Bolivia going back into Estenssoro's term in the earlier 50s. The U.S. government had offered economic assistance with certain demands attached, and also even military aid to Bolivia throughout the 50s, but Estenssoro had turned it down, and which angered a lot of U.S. leaders. So the United States government realized that the revolution and Estenssoro's party was so popular among the average Bolivians that the U.S. couldn't even try to overthrow the Bolivian government and set up a new dictatorship, because when the party gets 83% of the vote, it's pretty obvious that they have mass public support. So the United States didn't even try it, at least not yet, to overthrow the Bolivian government and put it in the hands of some landowner or general or someone that would more closely follow instructions from the United States. So Suazo is largely unelectable because he's gone back on a lot of his economic promises from the election in '56. So the new election is going to happen in 1960, and Estenssoro comes back and he runs for re-election for a second term in 1960. And he wins, so he will serve a second term from 60 to 64. Largely continuing a lot of the same policies as his first term. The bigger political problem for Estenssoro, though, is that he's a fairly young guy, and he's obviously very ambitious. And after the kind of experiment and failure with allowing someone like Suazo to run for office and take up future leadership of the party, Estenssoro doesn't really trust a whole lot of other people to lead the party. He's afraid of future leaders kind of turning their back on the population again. And so he starts publicly talking about just possibly running for re-election over and over again, which angers a lot of people in his own party that are really waiting for him to retire so that they can run for president or other higher offices. Famous lieutenants under Estenssoro, they start leaving the party and setting up their own parties just to have an opportunity to run for office, especially the presidency. So in the early 60s, Estenssoro's party really splits down into a few different factions. And he realizes it's going to be very hard for him to try to win the next election because the support base is also split along those factions also. So what he did in 64, in the next election, he's going to run again for re-election. He nominates a military general to be his vice president in order to get a certain faction of military supporters and even some conservatives on his side in this election so he can get more votes. And it actually worked. Estenssoro is re-elected president in 64 along with his vice president. They both go into office. So it worked to win the election, but it doesn't work for the long term because 3 months after they're inaugurated in 64, the general deposed him, basically kicked him out of the country, and Barrientos made himself president of the country and kind of runs the country with another general, but Barrientos is the most famous and seems to be the kind of dominant one in the deal. So in 1964 you have this internal coup, and suddenly you again have a president who is right from the military, and his loyalties are completely dedicated to the military. And the United States likes this a lot. The U.S. government immediately recognizes Barrientos as the president and kind of makes friends with the new Bolivian government and continues sending loans and economic support and other things to kind of prop up the government. Barrientos will push what we call market-based reforms and anti-communist policies. So he makes similar promises to the United States that people like Suazo had. We'll keep the communists out, and we're going to start breaking down a lot of Estenssoro's long-term policies, really turn power back to the conservative landowners and business owners in Bolivia. So anti-communism was one of the central things that Barrientos promised. Make sure that the communists can never really organize themselves and make any attempt to get into power in the country. And this includes some massacres against striking workers every few years. And the United States is very friendly toward that idea because the U.S. wants to win the Cold War and wants to make sure that Bolivia does not become, again, another Cuba. So Barrientos tries to gain peasant support, kind of poor agricultural worker support for all this kind of stuff. But those workers are already largely dedicated to Estenssoro and that political party, so they had already been empowered by someone else and other strategies. So most of the agricultural workers still supported people like Estenssoro and the political party that he had formed, and they start discussions about resistance to this new military dictatorship. Barrientos and his government is probably most successful at repressing communists and making sure there's no revolution in in Bolivia, and were so repressive that by the mid-60s, by about 1965-66, the government is a target for guerrilla movements and revolutionary movements, even including Che Guevara, who came over from Cuba, left the Cuban Revolution to Castro, and went to Bolivia to try to start a revolution there, hoping that if that's successful, that could ignite general revolutionary movements all throughout South America to overthrow U.S.-backed dictatorships and other puppet governments. And Guevara's idea seemed to be generally to overthrow foreign control of South American governments and then bring all those South American governments together into like one South American superstate that might run even the whole continent, which the United States found very threatening to U.S. power in the area. So the U.S. sent in the CIA to Bolivia to help Barrientos's people basically track down Che Guevara and kill him wherever he is in the mountains hiding in Bolivia. And Barrientos also pushed through what we call neoliberal reforms, which means basically free market type economics. Barrientos will start cutting back on the amount of social systems like schools, start cutting back on teachers' wages, start cutting back on the minimum wage for all Bolivian workers. We'll do a lot of things to end a lot of government intervention in the economy. So that's generally what we call neoliberalism, and there's other ways of defining it. It's like a whole package of economic policies. Barrientos didn't do all of them, but he did some of them. So this is some of the first times that we'll see the word neoliberalism even used at all in the mid and late 60s. And it'll become much more frequent in the 1970s, 1980s, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So Barrientos died in a helicopter crash in 1969. And when he died in 69, that opens up the possibility of other generals taking over, and they basically fight each other politically. You get a kind of revolving door of several different generals that claim to be president for the next couple of years, until one general named Juan Jose Torres finally took over and stabilized the situation in 1971. So he seemed solidly in control of the government until once he was in control, he started turning to much more radical kind of leftist policies, started signing economic deals with the Soviet Union to start building some factories and tin smelters and places like that to get more industrialization. And then Torres, still in 71, tried to replace the entire Bolivian Congress with the Soviet lawmaking system. And that scared the United States so much that they hired other generals to basically overthrow Torres in 1971 after just a few months in office, and place another general in charge. And their chosen choice is a guy named Hugo Banzer Suarez. And Banzer is much more repressive than really any of the other Bolivian leaders that we've talked about so far today. He completely banned all leftist or left-wing political parties. He suspended the Workers' Confederation. He closed universities that kind of spoke out or passed resolutions against what he was doing, suspended nearly all civil rights in the country, and then militarily occupied the mines in order to force the workers to keep working. So this was very upsetting to a lot of Bolivians, but the Bolivian conservatives, the big landowners and whatnot, were somewhat supportive of it, and the United States is very supportive of it. So a lot of Bolivians start defining Banzer as just a U.S. puppet who is kept in office just through U.S. influence. And when U.S. President Carter went into office in 1977, Banzer's been there for 6 years by that point, and it's well known what his ideas are and how he's going to implement them. U.S. President Carter actually had discussions with Banzer and the Bolivian government, really trying to push Banzer to stop this dictatorship and start allowing democratic elections again. So in 1977, Banzer and the government allow elections to happen. They create their own political party, but they lose. the elections in 77, and rather than admit defeat, the military then removed Benzer from power, annulled the elections, then another couple years of different generals fighting each other to see who's going to stay in power starts up again. The end point of that is in the early 1980s, where you start getting new leaders after a few years that will start the transition to some amount of democracy. So democracy will finally start to get going by the mid-80s again, after 20 years of pretty clear dictatorship. And that will move us into our next country on the list, which is Chile. Chile, the last time we talked about it, had these elections in 1946 that really had fractured the Chilean political scene. There's several parties that competed against each other, so no one of them got even close to a majority of the votes. And in the 1950s, inflation rose to be the Chilean government's biggest problem overall. Chilean inflation in the 1950s would be worse than in any other Latin American country, so even worse than Argentina. So this is a very potentially destabilizing problem. The president at the time in the 1950s asked the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for help, for basically emergency bailout loans. The IMF, though, demanded not just the normal budget cuts that they demand of almost any government that makes that request, but the IMF also demanded the power to run really all government's economic policy in the whole country. So the IMF would literally take over policy making in Chile if the president agreed to this deal. Most Chileans hate this idea and said that this is, international bankers coming in to colonize us, possibly under direction from the United States. So most Chileans are very angry at this idea. They're very afraid of it, and they feel like they're going to be controlled by a foreign power if the government accepts that deal. But Ibanez, the president, did go for it. So he said that Chile was in such a difficult economic position that there's really no other way out. So the IMF comes in, gives the emergency loans, starts cutting the government budgets, starts cutting government subsidies for public utilities like electricity and water, and then for the transportation system. So it becomes much more expensive to pay for basic things you need in your house, like electricity, water, trash service. And it also becomes much more expensive to take a train or a bus or any other kind of public transportation. And this quick rise in prices start riots in the capital city, Santiago, that start spreading to some of the other major cities around the country. So this all seems like a disaster that the population did not want and was very resistant to in the 1950s. So this leads us into the 1958 presidential election that will basically boil down to the guy here on the left, whose name is Salvador Allende. He was a doctor. He had led some kind of social reform movements and was very much on the left side of politics. He identifies as a socialist, but he also appeals to communist parties, so he's pretty far left in his policy ideas. And basically all the rest of the parties are so afraid of Allende actually winning this election in 58 that they all unite behind a single candidate named Jorge Alessandri, who was the son of the former president Arturo Alessandri. And with that general kind of middle and more conservative support, Alessandri won the election and will go into office in 58 and start putting his policy ideas into place. What are those policy ideas? It's mostly free market neoliberalism. He wants to stabilize the money supply. He wants to devalue the currency to a certain rate. He wants to attract more foreign investment, more capitalist investors from foreign countries to start putting money into building factories and warehouses and whatnot to build up industrialization in Chile. Alessandria is also willing to take a lot of money from the United States, largely to build up roads and hospitals and schools and whatnot. Alessandria also passed a land reform program that he said would start confiscating kind of extra land that the big landowners owned and start giving out amongst a lot of the poor peasants. So they do pass a law, but they don't actually implement it very much. So they passed a law saying the government can do that, but under Alessandria, the government doesn't really do it very much at all. So the critics say, that's just his excuse. It's his kind of propaganda saying we're doing something for poor people, but in the end, they don't really accomplish very much. One of the general problems that we've seen with neoliberal economic theory is that it might get some amount of economic growth, it might cut down on inflation quite a lot, but its long-term result is what we call income inequality. It means generally that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And Chile started seeing that quite a lot by the early 60s as Alessandri is about halfway through his term in office. The next presidential election happens in 64. Allende runs yet again. Same kind of policy programs, very much to the left, kind of appealing to socialists and communists, which again scared people on the right and in the middle so much that they formed an alliance under similar kind of unity candidate named Eduardo Frei. And that meant that he was able to get a majority of the votes and won the election. And Frei's economic policies are very similar. He wants a little bit more government control over the kind of capitalist flood of investors that are coming in and making quite a lot of money. So his basic argument is, he says capitalism is good, but it has to be more efficient. So his idea is that Chile is much like Bolivia. A lot of its economy is based in mining, especially copper. And with all these foreign and private investors coming in and either buying up mines or setting up new mines, Frei says that the government should take a stake in that in order to help make those companies more efficient, make sure they're paying their tax obligations and whatnot. So Frei calls this the Chileanization of the copper industry, to make sure that some amount of Chileans, either through private investors or through the government, actually have a stake in the mines that are pulling the copper out of Chile and selling it around the world. Frei wants the government to buy stock in those companies, basically, and he says that that is the best solution. Problem is that that solution didn't really work. It didn't seem to have much effect at all. The United States kept pushing more and more economic aid to Chile, and so did the IMF in forms of loans. It mostly seemed because, historians have argued, because the U.S. government wanted to prop up the government in Chile and make the president look good and make sure that the economy would do fairly well, hoping that Frei or some other politician would run for office in 1970 and defeat Allende and keep the communists out of power. The U.S. biggest fear is that Allende would somehow get into the government and start running things. So by 1970, Frei is really claiming victory, that all of his policies are working, no problem, just have to be patient, but the Chileans mostly seem to have run out of patience with him. So in the 1970 election, Allende runs again, and this time kind of unites several moderate political groups into a single political party called the Unidad Popular, and that is enough to get Allende and his party the most votes in the 1970 election. They don't get a majority, but they get enough to win the presidency. And U.S. leaders at this point are extremely afraid of Allende, that he might create another Cuba or bring communism into South America or something like this. So the U.S. President Nixon and his foreign policy advisor Kissinger are very worried about that, and they basically say that they cannot allow Allende to take office and actually run the Chilean government. Kissinger had a famous quote that got recorded in the Oval Office meeting with Nixon privately, where Kissinger said, quote, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people." So that's the end of the quote. So the U.S. government is thinking pretty explicitly at that point that democracy is great until someone that the United States doesn't like actually wins an election, and then democracy isn't really that great. And that seems to be as we've seen before, general U.S. foreign policy, not just in Latin America, but in other places in the world. So the American government is very worried that a democratically elected socialist government would go into office and fulfill its promises and become so popular that they would keep winning elections and would be seen as an example to other Latin American politicians that they could do the same. U.S. companies were also worried that Allende would start nationalizing big chunks of the Chilean economy and therefore take land and factories and whatever else from the foreign owners. So the Nixon administration tried several things to try to stop Allende from going into office. One of them was to make contacts with their friends in the Chilean Congress to try to figure out how could they stop the election from being certified. That didn't work, so the election was certified in the Chilean government. The Nixon administration next tried to kidnap one of the chief commanders of the Chilean army and convince him, pressure him basically, to help out in a coup against the government to overthrow the constitutional government and set up a dictatorship. That army commander disagreed during that meeting, and when he tried to leave, the U.S. spies basically tried to kidnap him and force him to do it. And he fought off the kidnapping attempt, and as he was trying to escape, they just outright killed him. It's pretty clear that the U.S. government is doing everything it possibly can to ensure that Allende is not inaugurated. But Allende is inaugurated. He becomes president of Chile, and at that point the Nixon administration starts implementing what it calls the invisible blockade. So these are going to be economic attempts to destroy the Chilean economy to the point that Allende will be forced to resign, or something's going to happen. And it's an invisible blockade because the U.S. government is doing this fairly secretly. It's not openly advertised across the world. So number one, the U.S. immediately stops all economic assistance to the Chilean government. All financial aid just stops. So that one, it's not openly advertised, but anyone who kind of pays attention to it would have noticed. Secondly, much more secretively, the U.S. ended all international loans through the World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, which any international institution that the U.S. had any amount of influence in. The U.S. tries to use that influence immediately when Allende goes into office in order to stop those loans to break the Chilean economy. They also tried to convince foreigners to stop investing in Chilean factories or whatever their investments are in Chile, and want to basically convince international capitalists to pull their money out of Chile to tank the economy. The U.S. government also started running a kind of quiet war economically in order to lower copper prices in order to, again, bankrupt the Chilean government and harm its overall economy. And lastly, the U.S. government through the CIA gave a lot of money to Chilean conservative groups like media companies, local political parties, and even anti-union groups. So groups that are opposed to unionization of Chilean workers. But this will take a while to have an effect. So Allende is in office and he's going to start implementing his program. And his program is fairly simple. He wants to freeze prices of goods out there in society, and he wants to raise wages for workers at the same time so that workers' wages can catch up to the price inflation that's been going on. He also starts nationalizing some major parts of the economy, especially the copper mines. And he nationalized them without any compensation to the former private owners at all, arguing that those companies had made illegal levels of profit for years and years, so there's no real point in paying those former factory owners when the government takes over their factory. He also will nationalize the coal and steel industries, so a lot of the mining and heavy metal industries basically, and also just over half of the banks in the country. And all this stuff is very popular amongst the Chilean workforce and the general Chilean population, because they share this sentiment that foreign investors and international bankers had done a lot of harm to Chile and kept it in a kind of colonial type economy. Allende also sped up the land redistribution program, not just trying to catch up with what he argued was supposed to have been done in the 60s, but to ramp up the system to do it faster. The big criticism is that they ramped it up so quickly that it was in a disorganized way, so the government could hand out land to individual peasants or families, but they fell behind in giving those families enough kind of loans to start their farming business or enough tools to actually do the farming. So there's a lot of criticism that it just grew too fast, too soon. And there's also a lot of criticism that Allende is doing this in 70, 71, 72. By 72, the economy is going wild. The price controls have kept the prices of goods down in the country. The wage increases have increased prosperity for the poor and the middle class. And the poor are getting land, but they can't really seem to do a whole lot with it. The economy is growing very fastly, very quickly, but it is also creating a lot of inflation because the government is so heavily involved in a lot of these things. It is creating government deficits. Imports start growing rapidly because suddenly these workers have all this extra money to spend. And this all happens at the same time as a big drop in copper prices around the world. So one of Chile's big productive industries takes a big hit in revenue just because world prices start to go down very quickly. And that, of course, convinces a lot of international investors to stop investing in Chile. They argue, what's the point in building a factory if the government might take it over at some point soon? If the government keeps increasing wages for the workers in the factory at the same time as they freeze prices for the stuff that the factory would make. So they don't see it as often a very good investment. And of course, Nixon's invisible blockade was basically economic warfare against the country. The Chilean economy grows virtually at a zero rate in 1972 and then starts going heavily backward in 1973. So it loses about 5% of the economy in 73, and all this starts a lot of very large protest movements around the country. And there's a kind of midterm congressional elections in March 73 that the opposition to Allende won fairly outright with the majority of the votes. Allende seems to realize that this economic problem is tearing the country apart, so he opens up negotiations with the opposition party about some kind of unity laws to rescue the economy. But the opposition basically refused to negotiate with them. And you get this amongst political parties every once in a while. They basically say they don't want to have their hands on a looming disaster. They don't want to be a party to it. They don't want to be part of it because they realize that they might get blamed for it in the next election. And they also realize it's easy to blame Allende and his party for having caused all this. So the opposition refuses to negotiate and basically says, you caused all this, you got to handle it. Many historians argue that Allende did not cause a lot of this, that inflation was a problem going back 20 years. By mid-73, there is talk within the Chilean military about forming a coup against Allende to knock him out of office and to set up a dictatorship. And when the U.S. government quietly gives its support for that move, the coup was launched on September 11th, 1973, when the Chilean military, its air force, attacks its own presidential palace. So rocket attacks and explosives on the presidential palace, trying to overthrow Allende. Allende decides to shoot himself rather than be captured, so he commits suicide. It is a very violent coup, killed about 3,000 people, give or take, in Chile. One of the most violent military overthrows of a government in Latin American history in the whole century. And the leader of the new government is named Augusto Pinochet. And he immediately goes about implementing most of the U.S. government's demands. So he's largely going to be seen as a puppet of the United States. And he will run a horrible military dictatorship that kills thousands and thousands of people. So he starts off by basically destroying the normal Chilean political system. He suspended the constitution indefinitely. He dissolved Congress, made all political parties illegal so that there wouldn't be anyone to argue against what he was doing. There's also a ton of oppression in Chile. He creates basically a nationwide siege over the people. Starts really targeting anyone who has supported Allende. Hunts them down in the country and either imprisons them or executes them, and also goes after any other kind of left-leaning politicians or anyone who's even come into Chile because they were exiled from other countries in Latin America who had just been living in Chile and had nothing to do with it. Goes after them also and largely jails or executes them. Pinochet set a curfew at 9 p.m. every night. He stopped media coverage of the government as much as possible and tried to end all labor unions. So Pinochet's government will stay in office through mass terrorism against the population through the 1980s. Another thing that they will do economically is bring in a lot of the leading neoliberal economists from the United States. And these economists will basically be given full freedom to implement whatever economic policies that they thought would help, especially to end inflation. So their turn is toward a free market neoliberal economy. And they do bring inflation down from somewhere like 500% in 1973 to only 10% 10 years later, even though most economists argue that 10% is still pretty bad. It's nowhere near 500%. How do they do this? They start cutting the government budget in every way that they can possibly think of. They remove entire government programs that are just gone, so any government workers that were employed in those programs are now unemployed. They cut worker wages throughout the country. They cut social services like schools and hospitals and roads and sewage and trash pickup and all kinds of things. They cut tariffs, which are taxes on imports. So government revenue is also going down. They cut government subsidies to transportation and utilities and things like this. They cut the amount of companies that the government owns and operates. So all those nationalizations that Allende had done, the government will basically re-privatize those industries, which means they'll put them up for auction for anyone to bid on, and the highest bidder wins. And because there's so many auctions going on at the same time for different companies, it doesn't take a whole lot of money to buy up sometimes an entire industry. So in the end, Pinochet in a few years privatized, auctioned off about half of all state-owned companies, often to the original owners who Allende had taken it from in the first place. And a lot of those auction prices were fairly small compared to the value of the company, just because they flooded the market with auctions. The one big industry that Pinochet's government did not privatize was the copper industry, which is still state-owned today and was likely so important, so central to the Chilean economy that even Pinochet and his neoliberal economists didn't even want to consider it. But Pinochet and his economists stay in power, again, largely through mass terrorism against the population. And that'll send Chile into the 1980s, and we'll talk later as we get into the 1980s about how that government is undone.